All right, today we welcome another SEAL to the Forge, and I think Tara likes to make fun of me that I have a certain fascination with, I don't know, I think special operators, but really, at the end of the day, it really comes out to be I'm fascinated by the Navy SEALs, and I'm not alone. You know, you hear names like Jocko Willink and David Goggins, and even one of our guests, Rourke Denver, and the popularity of the SEALs is not just with me. I think the public fascination with SEALs is pretty prevalent, and so I wonder, Rich, any thoughts on why that is? Why do people gravitate to basically asking all of you former Navy SEALs, how do you perform at a high level? I mean, what's there that fascinates people, do you think?
Yeah, it's first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great first question because because I joined the Navy SEAL. I joined the SEAL teams in 1996 when I graduated from college, and back then no one knew who the SEALs were. I mean, it was I had to, and I learned about the SEALs actually in 91 ish after the first Gulf War, and I didn't know what they were, and started reading a bunch of books and I said, man, these guys are pretty cool, and the training's really tough, and I that's why I kind of decided to try it. But we kind of lived this evolution. 96, no one knew who we were, and then the war started, and of course we had some events in '05 with Red Wings and Mike Murphy that kind of brought the SEALs kind of into the spotlight. So people started figuring out who they were, and and then we had there was some community level push to get the word out to recruit more SEALs. So the public started kind of learning who we were and what we did, and then of course we had Captain Phillips, and then we had Bin Laden, and then we had the tragedy of extortion, and so suddenly we were top of mind for everyone. So it was weird for most of us, especially those of us who joined before the war, to live this evolution. And I think just I mean, I just reading about the SEALs and the difficulty of the training and the fact that they kind of come from the water and they kind of do all this stuff was what drew me in. And I think anybody who kind of sees that and sees it in Hollywood and sees it on the big screen, it's just interesting. It's interesting to see that there are folks who do this stuff. Even though I would say the Hollywood version is certainly dramatized and glamorized. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens on the big screen that we actually don't do.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell you what those are because I want the enemy
Right.
to remain confused. So,
So I guess my fascination is, and I think this will lead right into the latest book that you wrote. But the fascination is, all right. So yeah, that the I don't know, for lack of a better term, the war stories are something that fascinates people. But we're seeing a lot of you former SEALs bring this into the business world. I mean,
mhm.
so those things that you learn in your SEAL training can actually be applied to the business world. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, war stories are war stories. I don't, as you know, in the book, I don't talk about war stories. I don't tell them. And I just want. I've always been fascinated with how you can relate certain experiences in a way that helps another person in a different experience. So how do you hop contexts? And I found that the best way to do that is to take those lessons and take them down to kind of the elemental level, because the more atomic you can get with these things, the more translatable they become. And so for me, I'm really fascinated with kind of what I call elemental human behavior. What is it that causes us to behave in the way that we do, especially during times of challenge, uncertainty, and stress? Because we all know the old adage, it's only during times of challenge and stress where the real us shows up, right? Well, I'm like, okay, what's the real us? And of course, I was in a laboratory inside the SEAL teams that showed the real us all the time because SEAL training, whether it be the basic buds or advanced training, is all about kind of challenge, uncertainty, and stress. So kind of going through it, and then of course running it, where I had to really look at it from a different optic, allowed me to kind of dive into a depth that I hadn't before. And then getting out of the Navy, I recognized when I started talking about leadership in business, and I was talking about high performing teams, I recognized that there were a lot of businesses and teams coming to me and saying, "Hey, we're forming these dream teams. Like everybody thinks the SEALs are kind of the dream team of Spec Ops, right? We're forming these dream teams, but when things go sideways, when things don't go the way we planned, and everything kind of falls apart, the team falls apart too. It turns toxic. So what's going on?" And I realized, wait a second, that people people outside in the business world and the teams and the kind of people building teams are having the same issues. And I said, okay, someone should write a book about this. And I said, well, maybe I will. So that's
So
really
that's the way it starts.
yeah, that was the attributes, the impetus of the attributes. So
I didn't realize, Rich, you and I actually, you joined the Navy almost at the exact same time I joined the Air Force. You stayed in a lot longer than I did.
wow, yeah.
Yeah. So you spend, I mean, you're talking about it now. You spend a lot of time and fascination around neuroscience, and you talk about it a lot. Even the neurochemicals that leaders can help release in their people just by making eye contact with them, or deep listening, or releasing chemicals like serotonin and oxytocin to make people feel nurtured and taken care of, which is really important right now as we're dealing with how to take care of our people in the workplace post-COVID. But where does the fascination really come from when you're, I mean, were you mentioned that you're looking at how teams function with the brain, but did that really start in the very beginning of your military career, or did it really, the neuroscience kind of take over when you got out?
So I think it was a little bit of both. When I began running training, and I was put in charge of training, not for the basic SEAL training course, but for an assessment selection for one of our specialized commands, I was given the task of trying to articulate our process more accurately, and that's when I began to say, okay, I need to look a little bit more in depth, and I need to kind of look at the peripheries of what's going on, and that's when I started looking at the neuroscience, because again, concepts are, concepts are very fun when they're philosophical and they're inspirational and stuff, but it's only when you can actually put raw science to it. You're like, hey, this is why this happens and why we feel this way, that people are like, oh, it clicks in, especially in a kind of a tough guy machismo world like the SEALs, right? You're not going to get a lot of the kind of inspirational kind of, lofty type stuff through guys who are very hard focused. Hey, this is what we have to do. And so you have to say, hey, this means this and this equals this because of this very kind of specific science. And so I became really interested in being able to articulate things in ways that were very convincing, because the facts back them up. It took kind of that inspirational quote off the wall and said, hey, this is why and how this works. And that's where I became fascinated with it. Of course, I was reading a ton, and I began to talk to people. And then I got out of the Navy, and I started hanging out with neuroscientists because I like to hang out with people who are smarter than me, and asking questions. Say, hey, well, how does this in fact relate? And was able to start putting that together, which is interesting. I think that makes it certainly makes it interesting for me, and it also makes it interesting for a reader to say, okay, this goes beyond just someone giving some advice or giving some inspirational quotes or saying, oh yeah, do this because this works and this is what's going on in your brain.
Yeah, Tara and I share your fascination with neuroscience and how it relates to performance. I think it's fun to dig into how that all works. And me being an engineer, I like data. I like research. I don't want touchy feely. I want something that I can hold on to. So I think that's important. And so, you talk about, you started hanging around with neuroscientists. I'm going to say this again, and I've said this before on a podcast. I think this is the decade. I'm going to call this the neuro decade. I think we're starting a decade. The 2020s are going to be this decade where we really go deep into what is neuroscience and what does it mean. And I think, lending credence to my argument, is we have somebody out there on social media that's just become a rock star that has neuroscientists attached to his name. And I just laugh. I want to get one of your good friends, Andrew Huberman, on the show at some point. Yeah. But I also laugh, and I would love to ask Andrew this. Hey, Andrew, when you decided to become a neuroscientist, did you ever think you'd be a social media rock star? I mean, he's everywhere. And so, I know you're working closely with him, and you reference him in the book. How did you come to meet Andrew, and what, do you have anything exciting you want to share with the listeners of what you guys are doing together right now?
Yeah, he and I linked up shortly after I got out of the Navy. We were actually both invited to a planning session where the guy who was inviting us wanted to kind of create a peak performance day for some C-suite executives, and so he invited a bunch of us. Andrew was there, David Goggins was there. David and I were the two SEALs, and Andrew was there. And this guy who invited me and said, "Hey, I can't wait till you meet this guy, Andrew. You guys are going to get along famously." And sure enough, we did. And I think um, let me answer your first question first. And that is, I don't think he anticipated when he became a neuroscientist becoming a social media rock star, but he's also extremely dedicated to getting this word out to people in ways that it's digestible. And you all know, I mean, he can explain it in ways like, oh, wait a second, that makes sense because he relates this to that and this to that. And we joke because sometimes he needs me to help translate that into regular speak, but he's just really good at it. And he and I actually gelled immediately on this idea of peak performance versus optimal performance because again, we were at this thing where this guy wanted us to figure out how to help people peak performance, a peak performance conference. And he and I we played along, but we both said, well, peak performance is actually kind of an unrealistic goal. I shouldn't say unrealistic, but it's kind of irresponsible because peak is an apex, and it's an apex from which you can only come down. And you have to plan for it, you have to prepare for it, you have to schedule it. Just like the pro football player has to prepare his entire week to peak for 3 hours on Sunday. We were more fascinated, and he was fascinated in this idea of optimal performance, which is how can I do the very best in the moment, whatever that best may look like. How do we step through that? Because sometimes your best might be peak and it might be flow state, but sometimes your best is like, hey, I'm dirty, I'm scared, I'm frightened, and all I got is one step at a time. And so in me, he saw someone who had come from a culture and a community who made that a habit, made that type of activity a habit. And of course, I saw him. He was someone running a lab, studying this stuff and studying kind of fear and people's response and how to step through. So we really gelled on that stuff, and we began to work kind of actively and proactively on deconstructing what this means to step through fear, challenge, uncertainty, and kind of in layman's terms, what is grit? Deconstructing grit. What does it take? And what are those things that are happening neurologically, and what does it take in terms of tools and physiological things you can do to step through grit? And so that's where we kind of started gelling, and yeah, it's been great because I'm so fascinated with what he does, and he's so fascinated with what I do, and so that mutual respect has allowed us to have really, really great conversations. And now we're both really busy, so our conversations are less, but but we certainly have them once in a while.
What's the big vision there, Rich? If you could kind of plan out where you guys are headed and what impact you can make going forward, what's the ultimate vision?
For us, the ultimate vision is to teach people how to step through challenge and uncertainty more effectively, and do it. Obviously, be able to do it when things hit us involuntarily, but practice it in a way that we can actually then proactively do it. Because those who I believe understand how to do this, and a lot of people who do it, they actually do it without thinking. They don't know what they're actually doing, but they're doing it habitually, just like most SEALs. But once you start putting language around it and putting procedure around it and practicing it more deliberately, then you can actually explore your potential. I mean, you can potential is always in front of us, right? It's not about what is, it's what could be, and so to explore what could be takes a step into discomfort and challenge and stress. It's inevitable that's going to happen. So if our goal is if we can get it out to people and teach them how to do it, and they can understand the steps, they can make conscious decisions in the moment that allow them to do this more habitually and more proactively, and then explore their potential.
And how do we start with that? So, as I'm listening to you, and I've listened to you talk with other people before about uncertainty, and Ron and I teach a lot on VUCA, so this is kind of right up our wheelhouse. But, in the military, you are trained and almost to the point of being excited by uncertainty. I know I was. The more uncertain, the more thrilling it was for me. That's not typical, though. And I think without training, embracing uncertainty and being able to move forward to find your optimal performances is not an easy task. So to the person that's saying, Well, I've been through 15 months of uncertainty. It's not looking like it's going to change anytime soon. What are initial steps people can take to embrace that, or
Mhm.
at least feel more comfortable in that discomfort of uncertainty, do you think?
Yeah. So at a basic level, ultimately, what's happening, and the military trains us to do this, but I don't think the military does it consciously. It's a kind of an unconscious genius, and the way they really what they do is they just throw us constantly into uncertain environments. And so we're really training ourselves because it's in fact a neurological process by which we move through it. And really, what it is, in fact, is our ability to create certainty out of uncertainty, because that's actually what's happening. So human beings want certainty. That's what we strive to get. We try to get answers and certain, and that's what we're just always trying to figure out what's going on. And so, for those who find themselves struggling, I would offer that that dealing with so let's just back up here, because we talk about fear. Fear is really the combination of two things: uncertainty plus anxiety. Okay, when you have both of those together, it starts to tickle your amygdala, and you start going into this kind of fight or flight fear response, the threat detector. You can actually buy down either one of those, or both, ideally both, so that you can actually more effectively move through it. You could buy down anxiety internally, and anxiety is a internal response. It's physiological. Pupils dilate, breathing quickens, things like that. So you can do breathing exercises that take your breathing to a more manageable rate. You can do open gaze, which effectively takes your pupils from a focused dilation to like, now I'm kind of noticing my peripheries. That's been proven to start shifting our bodies from sympathetic to parasympathetic, and bring us down off of that amygdala hijack, which then brings our frontal lobe, our conscious mind, back into play, because we know, in a true amygdala hijack, our conscious mind takes a
Right,
back
right.
seat, right? So the key is you don't allow that to happen. You need to be able to decide. You need to be able to think and consciously decide, as you're moving through it. So you can deal with anxiety. You can buy down anxiety, bring your frontal lobe back on track, and then you have to start thinking, okay, how do I deal with uncertainty? Well, dealing with uncertainty now, that's external. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to start asking yourself some questions, and the first question is, okay, what about this environment do I understand? However small that list is, because it might be 10% out of 100. And then you take that list and you say, okay, out of that list, what can I focus on? What can I control right now in the moment? Okay. As soon as you do that, you immediately take control, and you form a focused uh, uh, determination to step towards what you are controlling. And when you do that, you actually create a dopamine reward. Once you get that dopamine reward, it allows you to then ask the question again. And okay, what can I control now? What can I control now? Now that question is highly subjective in terms of what that goal you're choosing is, and it could be something a little bit longer term, like, okay, I'm just gonna focus on getting to the end of this day, or it could be like, I'm gonna just focus on the next 10 seconds. I mean, whatever that is for you. SEALs call this controlling your 3-foot world. You basically, what's that 3-foot world that you're controlling? Um, and that's literally how we do it. I mean, that's what you train to do, and that's why you got excited about it. And the reason why you get excited about it is because you know that process, in fact, is really rewarding, because you're getting through it, but also you're creating dopamine rewards as you step through this. Every time we step into our fear, we get a dopamine hit. And that's again a naturally designed reward system to get human beings to explore, to discover, to kind of move out beyond their comfort zone, to find new shelter, find new food. And so you got excited about it. You still get excited about it because you started to feel what it feels like to do that. I get excited about it because I know what it feels like to do that as well. For people who don't know what it feels like, they just simply need to practice doing it. And unfortunately, it just means stepping into discomfort more often deliberately, and then feeling the reward of doing that. And and if you do that enough, you're going to create a habit of it, and you're going to find yourself doing it deliberately, and kind of setting out on those goals that you've set, that you've kind of put aside for a while. Starting that project, doing whatever that is, talking to that person you've been avoiding because you're an introvert, whatever it is. You're going to find yourself doing that because you understand this system.
We need to cut that last 5 minutes out and just put that as a marketing, snippet for Forging Metal, because that's exactly what Tara and I like to, I don't know, preach. And I want to say something I think I want to emphasize this idea that take control of something and move toward that fear. And that, depending on how big that fear is, that could be something very small. I know as an ultra runner, I've run 50 miles more than once, and I can tell you that sometimes the best I can do is just take one more step.
That's right.
And so I think it's important for people to realize that, you mentioned getting to the end of the day. Maybe you need to back it down. If it's a really hard day, maybe it's just, can I make it to the next hour?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just want to emphasize that because I think that's important for people to understand. And I love your real world examples. One of the things that comes out of talking to SEALs is people go, people I think disconnect from, I'm not a Navy SEAL. I don't do those extreme things. And so I'm glad that you said, hey, we can do this and just, go ask somebody for coffee that maybe you find attractive. It could be any kind of, daily thing like that.
Move that needle, and that's actually what optimal performance is. That's taking control. That's saying I'm going to do the very best I can in this moment, whatever that looks like, and that allows us to, as individuals, do a couple things. First of all, understand energy modulation, right? Because we don't want to be peaking all the time. I don't need to be peaking when I'm driving to the grocery store. All right, that's a waste of energy, right? So I understand when and how I can modulate my energy, but then it allows us to actually pat ourselves on the back for just gutting it out. I mean, sometimes optimal performance is decidedly ugly and dirty and gritty and hard, right? It doesn't feel good. It's scary and all that stuff. Well, guess what? If we're performing optimally, we get to say, you know what? I did great. This is I talked to a lot of people who survived cancer, and this is them going through chemotherapy, saying, hey, during those days, I would just make it the next 10 minutes. I was just saying, I'm just make it this next. I mean, my friends who've gotten injured in combat and they've been, lost limbs and stuff, they're going through rehab. A good friend of mine who's in the book, Hank, lost both of his legs. He says, Rich, sometimes those days, I was just saying, next 5 minutes. That's all I'm going to do. That is good. That is great. That's optimal performance. And we need to start rewarding ourselves and stop giving ourselves unrealistic expectations of peaking all the time. Because it's both unrealistic and irresponsible, I think, from a health perspective.
I mean, COVID, this is a great example of COVID, right? For a lot of us, just getting through the next day is the best we can do right now.
That's right. Yeah, very few of us, the day one of quarantine, would have described our performance as peak, right? we were doing the best we could in the moment. And that, for a lot of us, like, okay, well, let's see what happens, But again, it's a conscious decision. It keeps your conscious mind online. It keeps that relationship between the limbic and the frontal lobe solid. One's not taking over the other, and I think it's a very powerful place to be.
We just got to manage and mitigate our negative self-talk with failure. I think that's the big thing, because as you're talking about optimal performance, I think Ron and I work a lot with imposter syndrome because we work with entrepreneurs and founders, and this is what comes up. And this is a tough one. This is the one that we find with everyone we're talking about, is that the imposter syndrome totally takes over. Any words of advice there? Like, as you're working through optimal performance, how do you kind of quell that, God, I failed, or I'm failing, or I need to do better? Because that can take over and ruin everything.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, when you're in the moment of stress, challenge, and uncertainty, it's not a very good idea to reflect in that moment. You have to keep in the present moment. Yes, if you might screw up, but you have to immediately say, "Okay, I'm going to do this. I got to do this the right way," and then you reflect afterward. Reflection in the moment oftentimes doesn't work. Now, reflection, however, is exactly what you need to grow, right? So you need to be able to look back and say, all right, what happened there, and what are the lessons I can take from that? That requires a period of time in between the challenge and stress and the reflection that most people skip, especially high performers. That's called recovery. Recovery is absolutely essential for any type of growth, or what I call anti-fragility. Can we actually grow from stress, right? Well, I didn't call it. Nassim Taleb called it anti-fragility, right? So, but how can you actually grow from stress? Well, that recovery time is going to be different depending on whatever the challenge or stress that you've gone through is. It could be short, it could be long. One of the keys to understand if you've recovered appropriately, because that's a question I get, and I know Andrew's gotten a lot, is how do I know I've recovered? How do I know I'm appropriately recovered? Is to gauge the emotional connection you still have with that event, right? As soon as you are in a position where you're able to detach yourself from the emotions to the extent that you can actually look at it objectively, you're in a position that you can actually recover effectively. Now, again, that duration is going to be different depending on the event. For some, it's a long time. For some, it's a short time. But the ability to recover is, in fact, necessary. When it comes to people who are kind of on the path, entrepreneurs or otherwise, who find themselves kind of always looking back, I will give you an analogy that I kind of thought of when I thought about how SEALs or any military unit, but certainly how we train on how to patrol. When you're patrolling, you're just basically walking as a unit, a platoon to a target, right? And you're usually in a line, and you have different positions. You have the point man who's in the front, you have the middle guys, and you have a rear security. Well, when you're training, you actually train in every role, so you're always training how to do all of it. When you're training to be rear security, what you have to do is, you're in the back of the pack. You have to always, once in a while, turn around and look at the pathway that you've just gone on, because you have to basically see it, because every road, every pathway looks different coming from the opposite direction. So the idea is, rear security is, if you get hit or contacted, you're going to be leading the patrol out, so you better get a good view on how that thing looks. Well, when you're doing that, the instructors, if you turn around and you're still walking, in other words, you're walking backwards, the instructors will smack you upside the head and basically drop you for push-ups, right? You're not supposed to be walking backwards, right? Because if you trip, if you fall, your weapon could go off, something bad could happen. You're always supposed to stop, turn around, take a look, right? And then turn around and keep moving forward. Well, all this to say that this is analogous to life, okay? You cannot move forward if you're looking back, okay? We have to look back once in a while because we have to garner those lessons. But in order to move forward, you have to turn around, you have to start walking, okay? And if you spend too much time looking back, or if you try to look back while trying to move forward, in other words, walking backwards, you're going to trip and fall, your weapon's going to go off. So it's always important to look back, gain the lessons you need to, and then turn around and start moving forward and forget about it, right? Or not forget about it, but just keep moving forward, right? So I think some of these lessons can be translated into how people might reflect too often, and in a way that's actually disempowering.
Yeah, that's great advice for backpackers and hikers. Turn around and look at the path. I was taught that to look back, especially when you get to a fork in a trail, because it looks completely different when you're coming the other direction, and people get lost that way. So I think that's important. I wish you would have been my coach roughly, 30, 35 years ago when I was playing baseball, because I really believe my biggest problem was, as some people have heard, paralysis by analysis. And so, and I've learned this obviously probably after the fact. I wish I would have known it sooner, but thinking about whenever we're trying to perform at a high level, thinking about it, I mean, we really want to be on a sort of autopilot when we're in that moment, and not reflecting, as you say, on, what did I just do well, or what did I do not so well. We can assess that later. I think you mentioned that reflection is important, but not in the moment. So I wish I would have got that message. Maybe I wouldn't be on this podcast with the two of you, and I'd be, a rich Major League Baseball player.
Well, it's another point on that, because it's important, is that you can't, when you're on a pathway, when you're going towards a goal, right? Some of the very information that's going to give you your answers isn't going to become visible until you actually get to certain points, right? So this is where I talk about rock climbers. So I always say, people ask me, what's a great piece of advice? And one of the things I say, because I learned this a long time ago, is I say it's always, you have to be resolute in your outcome, but be flexible in the approach. And rock climbers can teach us this, right? Because rock climbers will look at a face that they're going to climb, and they'll map out a general plan, right? And then they know that then they have to start climbing. And as they're climbing, that plan is going to change, because what they thought they saw from the ground is going to look way different when they're actually at the knot hole or the handhold or foothold. So they're actually just changing as they go. And sometimes the next best handhold or foothold is actually like to the left and down, right? So that means they have to move away from their goal to get a better handhold and foothold to get to their goal, right? Because the information has changed as they're going. So this is also analogous to when we're pursuing goals, is that sometimes it's going to feel like we're actually moving away from our goal, or we lose sight of the top, right? Because we're in an overhang or a valley or whatever. But that's only because we're trying to find a better foothold and handhold, and we're gauging the new information that's come to us, that's only presented itself to us because we've continued to move forward. So that's an important note too.
Does that resonate with you, Tara, as a former rock climber?
Absolutely. And all I can think of is, and I know we don't have time to go into your thoughts on leadership today, but that's what leaders are up against right now, right?
Yeah.
So I love the analogy with rock climbing. I think I'm going to steal that from you, Rich.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's talk about the book.
Sure.
Ron, you're
Yeah.
reading it right now.
I am. I got that bugger right here, and I'm enjoying it. And yeah, I recommend it to everybody to check it out.
And
So
well tabbed. So thank you.
yeah, let's dig in and tell us a little bit about this is a book called The Attributes. So let's get to the heart of it. What are attributes? Give us just kind of a little for anyone that has not read the book yet. How do you identify these hidden drivers of
Yeah.
performance?
Well, so a lot of the times the conflation most make of the performance is it's all skills. It's about skills. Okay, and I always say, when you're in SEAL training, for example, you spend hundreds of hours running with boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles and running with those on your shoulder and freezing in the surf zone and all that stuff. And I look back at my career, and I did hundreds of combat missions overseas, and I did thousands of training evolutions, and never on one did I carry a boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole on my shoulder, right? So the question is, okay, why do they make you do that? It's not to teach you the skills on how to be a Navy SEAL. It's actually to tease out some of these innate qualities, these attributes. And so when I started doing the work, I had to define the difference. Skills are not inherent to our nature. They're not innate. None of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball or, in the SEAL case, shoot a gun. We train to do those things. We're taught to do those things. All right. They also direct our behavior in known specific situations. Here's how and when to ride a bike. Here's how and when to throw a ball. And because they're kind of didactic and tangible, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can see how well anybody does any one of those things. You can score them. You can put stats around them. This is why most hiring processes make the mistake of assessing only skill, because they're very easy to see and measure and test. And you can put them on a resume and you can put them on a score sheet. The problem with skills is they don't tell us how we're going to operate in stress, challenge, and uncertainty in an unknown, uncertain environment, because in an unknown, uncertain environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. And so this is where we lean on our attributes. Attributes are innate. Okay, all of us are born with levels of patience, situational awareness, adaptability. And they don't direct our behavior, they inform our behavior, right? So my son's levels of resilience and perseverance, for example, informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. So they inform our behavior. And then because they're hidden in the background, they're very difficult to assess, measure, and test. You can't sit across the table in an interview, for example, and assess someone's level of resilience or perseverance or adaptability. They are the most visible and visceral during times of challenge, uncertainty, and stress, which made the environment that I was in, this laboratory of SEAL training, so great, because it was all about throwing guys into that situation. But from a human level, this is how we start to understand our behavior all the time, but certainly and especially during times of challenge, uncertainty, and stress, right? So the attributes that I write about are basically attributes that talk about how do we optimally perform as human beings. And I broke them into 5 categories: grit, the attributes that make up grit, the attributes that make up mental acuity, the attributes that make up drive, the attributes that make up great leadership, and the attributes that make up team ability. And then if there's a few others I talk about as well. But these are literally the attributes that start to speak to how we perform in all of these genres, and therefore how we perform optimally in life.
Are they static though? I mean, if so, I'm thinking of military training, and you're right. I mean, I did not carry a telephone pole, so hats off to you. But similar things throughout all of the military training, where it brings out, like you said, it teases out those attributes, and I'm gonna say strengthens them.
Mm-hmm.
But what if we don't have them? Or what if the attributes that come out are not really the positive ones? Can those
Right.
be taught or corrected?
They can't be taught; they can be developed. So, a couple caveats here, which thanks for bringing it up because I missed. First of all, we are all born with all of the attributes. Okay, the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. Right. So, for example, on adaptability, if 10 is high and 1 is low, I might be at level 8 on adaptability. That means that when the environment changes around me outside my control, it's fairly easy for me to roll with the flow. Go with the flow and roll with it. Okay. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability, which means the same thing happens to them. It's very difficult for them. Now they're still adaptable. It's just difficult for them, right? So we all. So if we were to line up the attributes on a wall like a series of dimmer switches, all of us would be at different levels, right? Our lines would look differently. Now, there's no judgment in that, okay? Because we are who we are. It'd be like judging our hair color. But you can, if you're lower on an attribute, you actually can develop it. You just can't do it the same way as you can a skill. So a quick question you can ask yourself if you're going to determine whether or not it's a skill or an attribute is to ask yourself, can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's likely a skill. If the answer is no, it's likely an attribute. So an example would be, so for example, Ron, you tell me, you say, hey, Rich, I want to go learn how to fire a pistol and hit a bullseye every time, right? I could take you to a range and teach you how to do that within about 2 or 3 hours, right? That's a skill. But if you say, hey, Rich, I'm pretty impatient. I want to learn how to be patient. I can't teach you that, right? That's an attribute that must be developed. So to develop an attribute takes self-motivation, self-direction, and it takes a willingness for that person to then step into environments that test and tease and develop that attribute. So if you want to develop patience, you have to go find environments that test and develop your patience, right? Having kids is a great example. That's a way to develop patience, right? So, but any one of these can be developed. It has to be individually done. So the answer is yes, it can be. They're just, that dimmer switch is a little bit more difficult to move than it is on a skill.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, this is also fascinating. I think you mentioned on a Rich Roll podcast, which Tara and I are both big fans of Rich, and I think you mentioned this idea that we can have, and I'm not sure if you use the word, we can have attributes that maybe are lying dormant. I
Yeah.
don't remember if you used that, but how
Yeah.
does that, number one, how does that happen? And how do we maybe discover what are our strengths or what are our attributes?
Yeah. Yes, we can have dormant attributes, and that dormant attributes is an attribute that we have a lot of. We've just never been put in a situation or an environment that's teased that out, right? So if you've lived a life of largely comfort and light or low challenge, you likely have a lot of dormant attributes you've ever figured out. Here's the good news: is that COVID actually and 2020 holistically challenged all of us, right? We were all thrown into stress, challenge, uncertainty. So we actually all now have a pretty recent vignette that we can look back upon and say, okay, how did I show up? I mean, which attributes shined and which attributes weren't? Maybe I wasn't as adaptable as I wanted to be. Maybe I was highly resilient and I didn't know that, right? So dormant attributes are those that we haven't seen yet. Although I would say likely every human being can probably think of an example where a dormant attribute showed up. If anybody has a story that they can tell that ends with the phrase "I didn't know I had it in me," it's likely a story of a dormant attribute coming to the fore that they didn't know about. Okay, and that's usually during challenge, stress, and uncertainty.
So for all the listeners, go out and find some challenge and uncertainty, and maybe you'll discover some of your attributes. And that's what I'm taking from this.
Yeah, that's when they show up the most. I mean, things like, you can see it if you're looking now. This is why I wanted to write the book, because as soon as you start putting words around things and articulate it, then people start thinking about their behavior in different ways. So you can in fact start seeing some of this just in normal everyday life. You can see, well, actually I'm inherently impatient, or I'm inherently patient, or I'm not as resilient as I want to be, right? Just by thinking about it. But it's those times of stress and uncertainty that really kind of kick it in, and it takes skills completely offline, and that's why it's kind of so visible, right?
I'm curious. Rich, you've been out of the Navy for about 5 years, roughly now.
Yeah.
So thinking back on the grit and the mental toughness and the attributes that surfaced during your time, Ron and I talk a lot about mental toughness is kind of, we're building a muscle. And I think attributes can kind of line up in that same way as well. And I think a lot of people, as Ron mentioned, are going through that teasing out their attributes during COVID. But just as leaving the military, when we come out of COVID, let's say, whenever that may be, 6 months, a year from now, if we don't exercise the mental toughness muscle, it can kind of atrophy. Is it the same way, do you think, with attributes? And do you notice, are any of these things, I don't want to say weakening, but maybe going back, not being in the forefront for you as you've gotten out of the military and been in civilian life for the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Rich, have you gotten soft?
I'm probably
Thanks,
the son
Ron.
yeah. So yes, the answer is yes and no. I mean, so I think of mental toughness as a combination of attributes. And honestly, if I were to define what mental toughness is for me, I'd say it's grit, right? Grit holistically is like this idea that can I persevere, can I push through? Because honestly, that invokes a lot more than just physical. And in most cases, the physical is almost like down to zero or sub-zero, and you're still pushing through. It's all up here. And so yes, the answer is yes. You can you can atrophy in some of those attributes if you are already low on them, and you don't consistently seek to develop them, right? So if you're naturally high on certain attributes, it's going to be naturally easy. If you're naturally adaptable, you don't need to practice it that much. It just happens. You just go with the flow. We know people like this, they're just fine when things happen. We know people who are naturally perseverant. We know people who are naturally courageous. We know people who are naturally resilient, right? So I'd say this is why I get really interested in kind of deconstructing things down to the atomic level, because if we take it down to the smallest pieces, then then people can start to say, okay, wait a second, it's not about this whole thing that I have to work on now. I'm actually good at this, and this. I just need to work on these two, right? And I'll even be even better. I need to do a little bit more with my courage. I need to do a little bit more with my resilience, right? But I'm great on the other two, right? So I think that's where I would say people can start thinking. And yes, if you are low on an attribute and you haven't developed it for a while, it will atrophy. It's not going to get any better. I think and again, I'm not a psychologist, so it's just theory at this point. But I think you can, through development, I think you can achieve conscious competence on an attribute that you are low on. I just don't think you can. I'm not sure if you can achieve unconscious competence on an attribute that you're low on. I think it's always going to be something that you have to think about, and in some cases, it's going to be contextual, right? So if you're impatient and you say, okay, I want to develop my patience, and you have kids, right? And you can develop your patience with your kids, right? And you're actually very patient with them. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate to other people's kids, right?
Yeah, right.
So sometimes it can be contextual. Like I'm pretty good at stepping into my fear, okay? And I did that when I was in the teams because I don't like heights. I've never liked heights. So jumping out of airplanes was always a challenge for me. When I was in the teams and I was jumping out of airplanes constantly, I got pretty good at jumping out of airplanes without feeling that fear. But I haven't jumped out of an airplane in several years, which means if I go do it again, which I likely will because my sons or my wife want to do it, I will have to work through that fear again because it's atrophied.
Gotcha. Okay, makes
Wow.
total sense. Yeah.
That I don't know. That's fascinating. A Navy SEAL that used to jump out of airplanes is going to have to work up to do it again.
Well, I'll tell you, the Navy SEALs, people, again, this is what you don't see in the movies. People think of SEALs as fearless, and we're not. In fact, fearlessness is irresponsible and dangerous, right? SEALs are able to do what they do because we've all, in some cases, mastered the ability to step into our fear. And to appropriately assess risk and then still do it, right? And so that's really that's really what anybody who's kind of steps into dangerous work has done. It's not that they're fearless. In fact, I would say, stay away from the fearless person because that person's going to get you killed, right? Because fear is actually something you need because it allows you to appropriately assess risk. But then you need to step into it more deliberately, more habitually.
I'm so glad you said that because I don't like the word fearless, and I think you would agree. Not only should we not try to be this ideal of being fearless, but we should use fear as an ally. I mean, it's something that, when harnessed properly, it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah,
it's not easy to do. That's not easy to do. I don't know that you could ever get me to step. I'm a pilot. I have no desire to jump out of it.
Right. It's totally different when you're flying. Yeah.
And I'm afraid of heights too. I couldn't rock climb like Tara did. So.
No, I couldn't either. I respect you for doing that.
Let's talk about, you said you broke down, you have 25 attributes in the book, and you broke them into categories. And obviously on this podcast, we want to talk about your grit attributes. And those are, as you describe them, as courage, perseverance, adaptability, and resilience. Now, this might be a leading question, but Rich, do you think those grit, if you were to put this into a pyramid, kind of like Maslow's pyramid, would you put grit attributes at the foundation of that pyramid? I mean, I guess the question is, without grit attributes, do any of the other attributes even work?
Boy, what a great question. I would say, I would say, for all intents and purposes, no. I think those are foundational.
That's the answer I was hoping for.
However, the caveat is we're in a world today where there's a lot of people who can go through life pretty comfortable their whole lives, right? And now, I'm not saying, I mean, there's always going to be a little bit of discomfort, but I don't know if there are probably some people who don't test and tease those as much. But yes, I mean, um, broad broad brush on this, I think the grit attributes would come first, and I think courage is the very first. That's why I made it the very first chapter of the book, and Mary made it the very first chapter of the or very first grit attribute that's required. Our ability to step into what causes us fear is elemental in our ability to operate in the world at all, I think.
How do we develop that, Rich? How do I get, if I'm somebody that wants to strengthen my courage attribute? Any advice?
Yeah, do things that scare you, and feel that, start feeling that reward that you get when you actually step into something that makes you afraid. And again, it doesn't have to be extreme, like jumping out of an airplane right away. It could be something simple. It could be starting a conversation with a stranger. It could be, standing up and giving a presentation to your colleagues. Whatever those things are, try something that frightens you, and then feel what it feels like to accomplish it, because it's going to feel good. Maybe not during it, okay, but after it, you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I just did something that scared me, and and it was horrible, but I did it, right? So that's how you do it. You have to kind of practice that.
Yeah, and I'm hearing be mindful about it, right? You step into that,
Yeah.
and you
Got
get
to,
that,
yeah.
you get that, I don't know, that dopamine release.
Yeah, because
and be
again, there is the
mindful.
flight. There's the flight response, and that means, that's also nature's way of saying, hey, some things you have to run from, right? It's never a good idea to fight a bear. So you have to assess risk, and sometimes the right decision is to flee. It's not always to step in.
Yeah, yeah, good point.
Rich, what's your strongest attribute, would you say, of the 25?
Oh wow, I've never gotten that question. That's a great one. My strongest attribute. Gosh, I would say. I would say I'm pretty good on perseverance. That's pretty strong, and I would say I'm pretty good on discipline. And I'm not. That's not self-discipline. It's this discipline I write about is the ability to set and move towards and achieve long-term goals, which is different than self-discipline. Self-discipline is the ability to do that, but the external world has no say in it, right? I mean, so like if I want to eat healthy or lift weights every day, right? I can decide to do that. The external world has no say in whether or not I accomplish that. I mean, if I say I'm going to eat healthy and I go to the Vegas buffet, the buffet's not going to throw pastries at me. It's my decision as to whether right? And so self-discipline is separate. Discipline, and it often requires self-discipline. Often, implies some structure, some certainty, and some rules and things, some stability, right? Which is why I'm bad at it. I did the self-introspection, and I realized I'm bad at self-discipline, but I'm good at overall discipline. Overall discipline are those goals that the external world has a say in, right? So you start moving towards it, and the external world is going to have a say, which means you're going to have to adapt and flex and kind of move and flow. And a lot of times the plan you had before is going to go out the window, right? Which I'm actually really good when that happens. So I'm pretty good at that. The best balance is to have both, right? But oftentimes you'll see someone who's, well, I would say oftentimes, sometimes you'll see someone who's incredibly self-disciplined, but they can't get their long-term goals achieved for anything, right? And sometimes that's because the self-disciplined person needs structure, needs certainty, needs a plan, it needs a routine. And nothing about long-term goals involves plans and routine. I mean, it involves light outlines, but if the external world has a say, you're going to have to adapt, and it's likely that the original plan you had is not going to be the plan that gets you to your overall goal. You have to be flexible. You have to be able to break routine. So that's why sometimes people get in trouble there.
It's so helpful that how you break the two apart, discipline and self-discipline. And it's counterintuitive to hear a Navy SEAL, for me, say I don't have strong self-discipline.
Right.
You wouldn't think that.
Well, again, I mean, some guys do. A lot
Yeah,
of guys have a
sure.
good balance, right? But again, the job is, I always nickname SEALs as masters of uncertainty. The job is
Mm.
to be able to drop into uncertain environments and figure that out. And if you're going to drop into any environment, you have to be adaptable. You can make no assumptions, other than, well, you make assumptions, but you can make no certain kind of stated facts about an uncertain environment. You have to be able to roll and flex and move and be adaptable. So.
I think good advice for all of us. Let's turn the discussion a little bit. I think it's on the same topic of being resilient, but you touched briefly about your transition. You talk about this in the book about your transition from military life to civilian life, and that being a little bit of a difficult time. And I know Tara and I have talked about this, and Tara had, I don't know if I want to use the word struggles, but she had her own struggles when she left the military. What, with the benefit of hindsight, what advice would you have to somebody right now as they maybe are transitioning out of the military to the civilian life?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things for any of us who are transitioning, or one of the things that takes most of, is courage, because in the military you are leaving an environment where um, everything's pretty certain. And I know I say that. I mean, Tara, I just said, well, the whole job is you're trained for uncertainty. But we also know that the structure around the job, our paycheck, our medical, all this stuff, all of our life stuff, is very certain, right? It's everything's done for us. So even the uniforms. Hey, just wear this uniform on this date. Check the calendar, you'll be fine. And we have other people who are in the same situation. So everybody around us is in the same situation. Most of us, when we get out, we suddenly realize that we're all by ourselves. I mean, there's no one. We're kind of, especially those of us who are kind of forging a new path and trying something different. Um, there's no one really in our situation. There's no one to lean on. There's everything is kind of uncertain, and it's going to take a step into our fear. And I think that's what most of us struggle with, is this idea that now I'm alone, quote, and you're not really alone. You just have to look for people who can support you, but you're certainly alone. You're alone in your endeavor. There's no leaning. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that most transitioning service people are going to encounter, and it's going to take courage. And it's also, I would remind people that there's a lot of help out there. There's a lot of services that help with transitioning vets, and a lot of people who help with funding and things like that. And then also know that I think the percentages are like, it's 90%. There's a 90% chance, or 90% likely that the job that you get coming out of the military will not be the same job you're in a year or two after leaving the military. It's going to change, right? And that's natural too. You're coming out of this very certain known environment, and you're kind of figuring it out for the first time. So you have to be flexible and know, hey, I'm going to start this, and I'm going to kind of figure it out as I go. And I think that also takes courage. But I think those are the two things I would say.
Yeah. Rich, talk to us about failure. What is your biggest failure that you're willing to share with us, and anything you've learned from it?
Yeah, I have lots, but I will tell this, and this is a conglomeration of failures, and I think it has to do with leadership and being in charge. And I think one of the things I found that always kind of bit me in the butt if I didn't think about it was that if I lost perspective on the idea that when you're a leader, when you're someone in charge, if you lose this idea, and actually even in human relationships, that people judge us on, well, excuse me, we judge ourselves on our intent, and others judge us on our behavior. Okay, and so if you're not transparent about your intent, then your behavior might be misinterpreted and looked at in a completely different angle of what you're intending to do, which can be bad. And I made that mistake a few times when I was in my career, where I wasn't transparent about my intent, and I was behaving in a way that was completely in line with my intent, but it was being interpreted and perceived differently from others who were just seeing the behavior. And so I think that's a good thing to think about in any leadership position, in any relationship. That's a good thing to think about, right? Because you have to be transparent about that stuff, or else it's going to be misaligned. You're going to get in trouble, and you're going to wonder, what the heck? I don't understand, and it'll be a hard lesson. So.